So I wanted to just talk about a study that I've been reading today that I think is really interesting, and it just helps to reiterate that there's more going on with fat storage than just calories in, calories out. And essentially what this study was looking at was a really interesting marker regarding fat storage called LPL, or lipoprotein lipase. And what this LPL does essentially is it will take the fat that's floating around in our bloodstream, in our LDL particles, and pull it into our cells. So essentially, the more LPL expression you have at a tissue, the more capacity you have to pull fats from the bloodstream into that cell type, into that tissue, and store it. So let's say you are talking about your fat tissue. The more LPL expression you have, the more capacity you have to take fat from the bloodstream and store it. So if you want to lose weight, you don't want to have too much LPL expression at your fat tissue, essentially. And so what this study was looking at was a group of women who went on a calorie-restricted diet. And then what they did was they tested their LPL levels prior, straight away post doing the calorie-restricted diet, and then down the line. So let me explain what happened. So first of all, they tested it before, and this was to just get a baseline level of the LPL. When the women had finished the calorie-restricted diet, they then tested their LPL, and they found really not that much difference. I think it dropped a little bit and then it stayed pretty much the same. So essentially, straight after completing the low-calorie diet, their LPL levels were pretty stable. But the interesting thing is, then when they looked at the LPL expression down the line, like several months down the line, in the presence of insulin, so they gave these people a little bit of insulin, like the amount that you'd get from a meal, for example, and they found that this increased their LPL expression at fat tissue majorly. What's even more interesting than this is that they then tested these women again for their LPL levels after consuming a mixed meal. So just a regular standard meal, a little bit of carbs, a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein, normal. And they tested their LPL levels. And what they found is after going on this calorie restricted diet, their expression of LPL after a mixed diet, after a mixed meal, was hugely elevated. I think this is really fascinating because it just goes to show that there are other things going on outside of calories that are going to contribute to whether or not we are going to store fat or burn it. Another thing that's really interesting about LPL is that insulin is going to increase its expression. So the higher insulin that you have, the more expression of LPL you're going to have at fat cells. What's really interesting, though, is lower levels of insulin. So insulin sensitivity tends to make you express more LPL receptors at muscle tissue. What does this mean? Well, what's great about being insulin sensitive then is that instead of pulling that fat into your fat tissue so you can store it, it's going to draw it more into your muscle tissue. And that way, that muscle tissue can use it to make its own energy. So I think that's really, really interesting. What about stress hormones? So other interesting studies that I can post up here too look at the relationship between insulin and cortisol. And what's really interesting is that both cortisol and insulin are going to increase LPL expression at fat tissue. But the interesting thing about cortisol, and so obviously the higher stress levels that you have, if you have really high stress levels all the time, like high cortisol all the time, it can make you essentially store more body fat. But the interesting thing about cortisol, though, is it tends to make you store it more viscerally. So it will, instead of making you store it, in your adipose tissue in your periphery, it tends to make you want to store it more around your midsection. So it increases the expression of LPL around the midsection rather than the periphery. I think that's really, really interesting. Another thing that you might find interesting too is that our sex hormones do play a bit of a role in our LPL expression, or quite a role. So as I'm sure you've noticed, women will certainly hold more body fat tissue around their, lower half. So around their butt, thighs, and also the breast area. That's where women hold a lot of, express a lot of LPL. And it's due to insulin, sorry to confuse you. Because women have a lot more estrogen, it makes us express more LPL on our breasts, on our butt, on our thighs, and our lower part of our stomach. That's what estrogen does. On a male, for example, they don't have as much estrogen, they have more testosterone, which can make them hold it more around their midsection. So I just think that's really, really interesting. And something that's fascinating about women when they go through menopause, of course, is that our levels of estrogen will actually drop. And so this is why when you go through menopause, you have a more chance of developing, metabolic issues like heart disease and things like that, because you're not able to actually hold body fat in the quote unquote healthier areas like our butt, hips and thighs. You're going to hold it more around your midsection. Again, this is why males also are more prone to metabolic issues like that too, because they do tend to hold it more viscerally. Anyway, if you've got any questions on this, I hope you found this video interesting, and yeah.